Hello. It is. We're going to start in less than a minute. So if you are standing and want to be seated, please come have a seat. Hi. Good evening. I am Stephen Collins. I'm the CEO of Matter. Welcome to Tales from the Trenches. For those of you who haven't been to this program previously, we do it roughly once a month, and we bring in entrepreneurs who have built and are building interesting companies and try to get under the surface. What are the stories? What have they learned? What are the trials and tribulations? What are the pains? What are the glories of being an entrepreneur? And really understanding, getting some additional perspective on what does that journey look like. So tonight we have as our guest Prashant Srivastava from Evive. He spent the last 13 years building this company, growing it organically for 12, and then taking a big slug of money about a year ago. He's got about 300 people in the city. Really a data-driven way of improving the employee benefits experience. He said a minute ago that he is happy to share a lot of the lessons he's learned over the years that have caused him recurrent PTSD. So I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation. And I'm really excited. Our moderator is David Cohen, who is the CEO of a member company Regroup. David and I met probably a year and a half before Matter actually opened, and he was working on a sort of telepsychiatry business. I think he would be the first to admit that at that point in time, his business model wasn't exactly optimized, and he was really working to figure out product market fit and what the product would be like and kind of how that would ultimately work. I twisted his arm when we opened Matter, and he moved in, was one of the very first companies to move in, I think on the first day, or at least first day? First day that Matter opened. And while I don't think Matter can take credit for his success, I will say that since he joined Matter, it's been an incredible ride. He now has about 150 people. Last year did 100,000 telepsychiatry visits, is operating in 25 states, and is really growing a fantastic business that's providing a needed service that he had latched onto all those years ago. So he could be just as easily in either seat, but so that qualifies him in one sense to do this interview. The other thing that qualifies him to do this interview is he happens to be the brother-in-law of Prashant, so they know each other. And when I was wondering, would he be a good interviewer, I asked him, do you know him well, and you guys get along? Because I didn't want to make any assumptions about that, and he said absolutely, certainly, and so I think it'll be a really good conversation. If you have questions, he'll be using the Social QA platform, so go to matter.socialqa.com. That applies equally as well for people who are watching the live stream, and he'll weave those in to the conversation as appropriate. So with that, please welcome David and Prashant.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Stephen, for that kind introduction. I want to just share a little bit about Prashant and my relationship so you guys understand what's happening up here. We basically only see each other on Sundays, and Usually we have long weeks, and our conversations are basically a series of grunts when we see each other. So we do not talk about business at all. I've learned more about Prashant and Evive in the last 24 hours than I have in the last years.
The prep call was worthwhile.
Yeah, I didn't even know what they, no, I'm just kidding. I knew what they did. But so it has been great, and I'm realizing through this process what an incredible entrepreneur my brother-in-law Prashant is and what kind of company he's built. And hopefully we can get at some of what's made this company great and what makes him a great entrepreneur. Today, where I want to start, Prashant, is really going back in time a little bit. Background on you, early interest, experience. What set you up for this career? Take us back as far as you want. I'm in behavioral health, so I'd go, first memory if you want. But we can.
First memory. I will say this, as part of the private equity round, I went through a 5-hour psychological evaluation. And that was the last time I heard another person tell me that I should go as far back as my first memory. Although, just for full disclosure, the company is called GH Smart, and they're really all about improving your accuracy of hiring the right person. And I just went through a 3-day training for that, because the biggest decisions you make and the biggest mistakes you make are hiring the wrong people. And I've made plenty of those. I can spend like a whole week on that separately. But back to this. So I think there's sort of two, when I look back at my whole life, sort of two things have been important. One is sort of learning. And so like I was a little kid in a little town in Ahmedabad, India, and I somehow find myself doing a PhD at Michigan State University, which I didn't even know where it was. I'm old enough where, some of you are old enough, most of you are old enough where you do remember pre-internet days. And so I didn't really look at a map. I just said, I want to work for this guy. Oh, he's in Michigan. And I was born in a place where it's 120 in the sun in the summer and 90 in the winter. And so I show up in Michigan, but I decided I was going to work for this guy and I was going to do a PhD, because that was sort of the learning part of that. I was like, if you're going to learn, you're going to learn all the way. You're going to go do a PhD. And so I get admitted to Michigan State University. I show up on August 6th of 1997. And I think, first of all, I've died and gone to heaven, because Michigan in August is beautiful, right? I was just in South Haven for a vacation, and I was like, oh my God, I forgot how beautiful this is. And I show up on Michigan State grounds, and the whole place looks like a golf course. And I've never seen green grass. In India, the grass is brown because it's so hot. Right? All the Indians in the room know this, right? This is a fact. Yeah, this is a fact. But I think from there, I finished a PhD, and I went to work for Pharmacy and Upjohn, later became Pfizer. And again, I'd already done everything I'd ever imagined. I was like, wow, this is a great job. I'm just helping commercialize new drugs, bring them to market. I worked on Celebrex and all these fun drugs that came to market, and I was like, wow, what am I going to do next? And so I was like, well, I need to go learn more about business. So I went to Booth and sort of did that for a while. Got out of there, and I wanted to learn more about the mechanics of healthcare. I was telling Stephen, like when you're in a pharma business, you know very little about payment. Like you're just like, oh, we're going to invent the next best therapy for X, and we're going to commercialize it. Like you don't know anything about the business of healthcare. And so as I went to Booth and I learned more about like this massive area called healthcare services that A, was unregulated, so you didn't have to have hundreds of millions of dollars to commercialize a drug. You could go find a niche and fill it. That I had to learn about the business of healthcare, and I joined a disease management business, where I learned actually how things got paid, who actually paid for healthcare in America, not the insurance card in my pocket. And so as I learned all of that, I realized that there was a huge need to take sort of data-driven data and turn it into information for people. And even today, we all laugh and say, oh, healthcare is going to be a consumer business. Well, 10 years ago, they said healthcare is going to be a consumer business. And I said, I don't see anything about healthcare that seems consumer-friendly. Even after 10 years of doing this, I see some things, but healthcare is not a consumer business still.
So I'm going to stop you for a moment. You studied as a chemical engineer. Why did you choose that? How did it impact your career decisions? Does that play a role in the way you think about things today?
I'm a glutton for pain. No. I think I had a sixth grade chemistry teacher who was so influential in my life. I had no plan B. I was like, I'm doing something with chemical engineering or chemistry. And again, for all the Indians in the room, like the chemists are the people who are very good at chemistry but don't have jobs, and chemical engineers are very good at chemistry and have jobs. At least that's what my parents back there told me. And so I went to engineering school. But again, it's about learning, right? So I go to chemical engineering and I worked for ExxonMobil for a little bit, and I felt such a sense of pride in everything that every gas station I passed by, I was like, oh, I have a little scent of refining that, put that stuff there. So impact then became sort of the second focus. So I joined Pfizer and I brought some new drugs to market. And so between learning and impact, one of those sort of, I continue to drive that every day, even at Evive today, 10 years in. And there are some Evivers and former Evivers here. You all know this. I still say that I learn new things every day to this day, and I'm super proud of the impact we make to millions of people.
So I want to talk a little bit about how Evive got started, that story. But before we do, why don't we just touch on what Evive does today, and then we can loop back around.
Sure. So, by the way, we recently had like a vision, mission, all this stuff. But what we know now sort of is much more succinctly. Evive's vision is to help employees live healthier, financially more secure, happier lives. And the way we do that is we provide trusted guidance using data at the moments where that matter most. So think about a person that's going down a journey where they have chronic back pain and their doctor recommends something, and they go do an MRI, and then a set of events follow, and they're just going down the journey. What Evive is doing is we are looking out for that person by looking at that stream of transactions coming through and figuring out, are they headed to back surgery? Do they have the right treatment plan? And interjecting it in a resource that an employer has, an expert medical opinion service, into that process so that they get the right treatment. And in that particular example, about a third of the time, there's so much practice variation that about a third of the time, those surgeries are avoided. And so that's sort of an example of Evive sort of keeping track of people and making sure that they have the right information so that they take the right healthcare journey that's most effective for them.
And tell us who Evive's customers are.
So our customers are large self-insured employers who pay for the vast amount of healthcare in America. And when we figured out as part of the last disease management business that they are the ones who have economic motive, both in terms of healthcare costs and employee as an asset to invest in this type of service, so that they would either reduce costs or get that asset in great shape so that they would produce more widgets, airplanes, whatever they're producing.
We were having a really interesting conversation earlier today on what sort of return your customers look for and how they quantify that. Anything you want to share on?
Yeah, so for a long time, benefits managers are viewed as a cost center, right? I have responsibility for a budget, a healthcare budget that's growing at 5, 6, 7, you name the percent a year. And what we've tried to do is sort of talk about two sides of the equation: value, which is you're really driving recruitment and retention using benefits. That's how benefits were invented in the first place in 1929. When you have a wage freeze, they try to get around it by offering fringe benefits, et cetera. And so the economic value should be viewed in two terms. One is recruitment and retention, which we measure by using benefits NPS, or NPS, how likely are you to tell somebody else that you should work at company X because of its benefits. And then B is sort of cost of those benefits. And a great benefit manager optimizes the ratio of those. So you're willing to spend more money sometimes because the key sort of economic driver for a corporation is those employees staying and producing widgets, airplanes, et cetera. And so NPS is a surrogate for that recruitment retention metric, and the cost is the cost. We all know it.
Yeah, I mean, when we were talking about this earlier, what struck me as really interesting about that was the competing motivation of the employer to both improve healthcare for the employees, but to retain them, and in some ways to lower the cost of recruiting and engagement of employees. It was fascinating.
Yeah, it is. It really is. I mean, there are situations where you might want to raise the deductible and make narrow networks and cut the formulary, and all those are going to reduce the denominator. But you have to think about the employee as an economic asset to the company. And if it makes him or her upset enough to get out of there, or some marginal proportion of those, particularly the ones you really want to keep, right? The ones you're in a war for talent for, you really have to strike this balance. And I think about the benefits manager as having a portfolio of benefits, some of which reduce costs, others improve NPS or perception. And the balance is getting it right, right? Every corporation has a cost equation, right? At Google or some other place where revenue per employee is very high, they might want to invest more money in benefits because they can from a cost model point of view, but the value of that employee is also high, so NPS value is also higher. And so the ratio really is what you're trying to optimize.
So let's go back to the beginning of Evive. What was the thesis when you founded the company? What problem were you trying to solve? What really sparked that? And why, of all things to work on, why this?
That's all I knew. So I remember sitting in a restaurant in Waukegan, it was called Ram Brewery. And my co-founder had come back from a US Preventive Services conference. And he comes to me and he says, these guys have the guidelines for evidence-based medicine. You know, if you have polyps greater than 3 millimeters, you should get a colonoscopy every 3 years. Otherwise, you should get it every 5. If you had any polyps at all, otherwise you get 10. And these guys are all excited. They have looked at all the evidence and they've come up with guidelines. And nobody knows it. Nobody. And so we're like, well, why don't we send people reminders for that? And we're like, well, not only should we send reminders, we should send them in a way that consumer marketers talk to them. So we should create content that's indexed to people's mental decision models so that we learn something about them from their response. And by the way, this is happening to us all the time, right? Every ad you click on the internet is being tracked for your profile, and that's how they're making content better for you, right? And so 12 years ago, there was no sort of AI machine learning buzz, but we said, why don't we create a closed loop system where we can help people do the basics of healthcare, blocking and tackling, mammograms, colonoscopies, et cetera. And as we do that, we want to do it in a way that is a constant A/B test so that we get better about discerning what they're likely to respond to. And so that sort of simple idea still remains at the core of Evive. We're sort of triggering the right stuff to the right person, but then framing it in a way or figuring out how to frame it in a way that it's more acceptable or more responsive to that individual person.
So I think probably every entrepreneur I've ever spoken to has had to make pivots along the way as they develop, find product market fit. Was that your experience? Did the initial thesis change as you've gone? And if so, how has it changed?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, look, if you've been around 12 years, you've pivoted a few times. The name on the front is still the same, but we're probably on our third or fourth company. And part of that, and I'll explain why I say that, because one is that, while our thesis was on data-driven guidance, right, the topics have expanded widely. Because our customers said, look, if you can drive mammograms, can you get these people to generics? Can you get them to consider at-home infusions rather than inpatient infusions for specialty meds, et cetera? And so we listened all along the way. And as we got to expand the portfolio, they said, well, what I also want to tell them about saving more for retirement, blah, blah, blah. And the company was called Evive Health at the time. We're like, no one wants 401k advice from Evive Health. So let's drop the health. And so we went through this massive rebranding exercise as the topics that we wanted to influence expanded. The only thing I'll say is it's still at the core of Evive is data is the core of all our guidance. So whether it's 401k data, your financial data, or it's your healthcare journey, everything we recommend is based on the core, on your journey individually. The domain topics have changed. Tomorrow we may recommend career switches, training programs. It doesn't matter to us. Data is a vector, and the closed loop data allows us to measure our effectiveness, but the domain has gone from health to wider.
Guessing there are a lot of entrepreneurs in the room, if you guys are anything like me, you probably remember exactly where you were when you got your first customer. Can you share with us a little bit the sort of first customer big milestone?
Yeah, so how many are healthcare entrepreneurs here? Okay, a lot, right? Fair amount. Imagine two guys that started a business, walked into a Fortune 1000 company and said, give us all your data and we're going to raise mammograms and colonoscopies. They're like, give us all your data? He said, right, so we had to find people who had known us before to trust the fact that, we would safeguard the information, that we would use it in a way that was responsible, etc. And all of that, by the way, is mandated by HIPAA anyway. But you still needed someone to take that leap. And so our first customer was Les Schwab Tires. If you've ever been to the West Coast, if you ever have a flat on the road, you call Les Schwab Tires, they'll come out and fix it for free. Because their hope is they build a relationship with you over time, they'll sell you more tires. And the first check was like 36 grand. So, we thought we had really, we were on to something. We got paid 36 grand. But I think we knew we were a real company when our third customer was someone we didn't know. And then Peter, my co-founder, says it's 1, 3, 10, 50, 100. And so when we went from 1 to 3, the third one was somebody we didn't know at all. And then when we got to 10, we're like, oh, we better take this seriously. And some Evive people in the room might remember this, but I said, oh, we better take this seriously. We're a real company. And I think that's sort of the journey. That's when the product market fit. Like when you realize you're like, wow, we must really have something because we sold it to 10 people. And one of the sort of benefits of bootstrapping is you're forced to deliver value to customers because you have no business otherwise. You're not in the business of running through money and not figuring out the market fit fast enough. And so we didn't know any better at the time, but I wouldn't do it any other way, that it forced us to figure out how to describe the value we were delivering to customers, how to measure it so that we could sustainably extract value from them in return for delivering them much more.
We often joke that one of the best things that ever happened to us was not being able to raise money early on because it forced us to really figure out what the value was to the customer. Sounds like you had a similar story. You guys made it much longer than we did without raising, which I commend you for. What about, though, the inevitable, we're on the webcam, so I'll call them oh-snap moments.
Oh-snap.
Any times you thought all was lost, hopeless, kind of, crying in your pillow at night? Yeah. Not that I've ever done that.
A few times.
If it's too raw, we don't have to talk.
No, it's not too raw. It's just there's a few of them, so I gotta pick a few.
We got good therapists in the room. So.
Right, I know. My wife is one too, right? Your sister. I think when you're like early, everything seems like it's gonna fall apart on one. I used to always say we're one customer away from making it, and inevitably you're gonna sell to bad customers. And you're going to lose some of them. And it's actually a blessing. And like looking back, it's like, oh my God, thank God they fired us because we would have died servicing them and we would never have made it. And so, when you lose some of your, our first customer stayed with us for 10 years, second one for 10 years, third one, but the fourth one went out of business and we thought, oh my God, they were a big customer. Like, we're not going to make it because, while you're bootstrapping, you're also like, hiring people and raising the burn rate. And so, a few times, and then a few times, each of us will have moments where we're like, we're projecting 100% increase in ARR, we're investing in front of it, and then the 100 sort of goes backwards. Some very wise man told me at the beginning, it takes twice as long and costs twice as much, and I laughed at him. And it took more than twice as long, and it cost more than twice as much, so he was right. Oh, he was still wrong, but he was generally right. and so, I think this journey, I think Stephen was saying about the glories and I'm still waiting for the glories, but the rest of it, this is a very difficult, it's not for the faint-hearted to start up something and stay at it, because there's lots of moments where you question your own self. And it's like I had a PhD and MBA, and I thought, wow, I was like really smart, blah, blah, blah. And there's many days you think, wow, is that really right? Because how did I make such a dumb mistake? How did I hire this head of sales? Like, he had no chance. And people mistakes are the hardest. They waste a lot of time in a startup and cost a lot of money. And so, I still spend a lot of time now. 80% of my job is thinking about people and talent. And that's why I'm trying to get better at it, because most of us are 50-50 on talent. And if we could be 80-20 on talent, we'd probably be a lot farther along than we are.
But you don't have the magic bullet, or do you?
It's
Because we're looking for the same one. If you,
I know. So these GH smart guys told me that this 90-minute Who interview that starts with your first memory and goes through,
but when
establishes trends. I'm drinking the Kool-Aid for now.
What I realize when I look at those things is that nobody would have ever hired me if I had taken.
Oh well, most entrepreneurs, by the way, are unhireable. Like, I'm untrainable. It's like you don't do this low probability stuff if you're smart and hireable, right, David?
Well, so I'm going to call my dad out for a moment. He's in the audience. He and I were having a conversation a few weeks ago, and I don't know if you asked the question or not. It was sort of like, well, why aren't the Harvard kids doing this? And my response is because they don't have to. They don't have to do this. So
right, the rest of us are still trying to prove a point, right?
Yeah, that's right. Anyway.
No, I think at our stage of company, and I think that's what David's saying is right, is at the very beginning, like, you need the unhirables. Because we're changing the world. And Jessica, you're in the audience.
The rebels, the square
we
pegs.
talked about this a lot. It's like we were a bunch of unhirable people who didn't know any better. We just went at it. Every day, we were fearless, right? If somebody told us, oh my God, healthcare data is and SNAP, is the word David used. And we have to clean it and all this. And we're like, okay, we're going to do it. Whereas if you're an established business, you're like, oh my God, we can't take this risk. What if it's wrong? What if we tell someone to get a mammogram when they shouldn't need one? What will happen? We didn't know any better, right? And so that's some of it, this fearlessness and stuff comes from that unhireable. Like, we wouldn't want to hire ourselves today.
I got nowhere.
But I think there are people for various courses, right? And so the first 30 have to be fearless, in it, they're in the tribe, they're killing it. And then when you make it, and that's why I said about the 4 stages, like at every stage, right? When you get to 1 million, when you get to 5 million, when you get to 20 million, when you get to 50, at each stage you need different people that bring different processes, systems, skill sets, and stuff. And I've had to re-engineer my own stuff. As I said, I don't do anything of what I used to do, period. Like, period. I was sitting in a sprint management discussion on tagging and, building code on AI and stuff. And I really loved it last week, but I realized that I shouldn't be in that conversation. I'm not doing our business any service if I'm in that conversation. That's not my role anymore.
But further, if you're hiring good people, they should be smarter, I think, than we are. And I don't know if you feel the same way. I know we certainly try to do that.
Certainly, right? We have our CTO came from narrative science and has done AI and all of this many more times over than I have, and now it's his. I'm looking at the next frontier.
So you bootstrapped this for years, and then you raised some outside capital. Can you tell us anything about what went into that decision? Did it change things?
Yeah. So when you start a business, you have to be ahead of the market. Otherwise, you're not doing anything new. You open a pizza joint. There's a lot of demand for pizza, right? And so we were ahead of our time for a long time, explaining that data could be used. The data could be used in ways where people wouldn't spook out. And for the first 5 years, from 2006 on, the first question I got in every sales meeting was, well, aren't people going to freak out? I'm like, well, they're checking it on Foursquare and on ER now. It's 2011. And so that question has gone away over time because the market, we're just more sort of open to that kind of personalization today from every sector in the economy, pants and songs and movies or whatever. And so for a long time, we sort of evangelized that this is the best use of data, period, and that healthcare data should be used for social good. And as we went along, we sort of got customers who believed that and went along. And then we knew we were onto something when we had more RFPs inbound in 1 year than we had in the history of the company, period. And we'd been at it for a long time. And we're like, oh, we're creating a category now. The market wants it. We don't want to be like the people that created search engines that we don't remember. We only remember Google, which was not the first, certainly not even the fifth. And we're like, if we create a category, we want to own it. And so that's when we said, we got to double down. In fact, most people here probably never heard of Evive because we were so busy doing either sales, software, or service. We weren't doing marketing. And so we said, well, we got to and in Bootstrap environment, very difficult to justify hey, we're going to put our stickers on this conference on the floor. And we're like, well, how are we going to measure it's useful? They're like, well, it's brand. Trust me, it's going to be great. And so when we raised money, it allowed us, first of all, to sort of take those risks, right? And the timing was right. So once you know that the market, broad macro factors are in your favor, you've established some track record. By the way, super important in healthcare, no one buys first. I remember going to this customer, he's like, I love this concept, but I can't be your first, I can't be your fifth, I'll be your 10th customer. And you're like, well, someone's got to go first. Everyone can't be the 10th or the 5th I remember one guy telling me I'll be your 3rd customer, 1 and 5th. So I had 3, 5, and 10 lined up, but I didn't have number 1. So does that sound familiar to anybody? Right? Like everyone. You're like, who's going to go first? And so I digress, but where was I?
We were talking about fundraising.
Yeah, so that's where and that's when we realized if you want to own the category you created, you got to go. And so we went out and raised money from a PE fund that sort of stands by our values, actually has no time horizon, which is super important in healthcare because when you're building a company in healthcare, it's going to take time. And you don't want to be making economic decisions based on the fund is coming up or not coming up. And these are questions I know now to ask, but at the beginning I didn't. And so I've learned along the way, you're like, wow, that's actually super important. The fact that their fund is not maturing, they don't have to sell off this investment or force you to do something else. And so we have an investor that's a long-term investor, a partner that allows us, again, to run the business in a way that we're generating long-term value. And we have the financial security of saying, if we need more money, we can go double down on this market that we really believe in.
So let us shift gears for a moment back to something we were talking about, culture, leadership. Tell us how you describe the culture at Evive, how you define it, how you describe it, what the values are, and how you keep people moving in the same direction.
So, when we were small, right, we were this sort of band of 20 or 30. We had this mission, and everybody was connected to either Peter or I. As we got bigger, we sort of deliberately sat down and thought about what the Evive way was, right? And so we put down our values on paper. It was curiosity, right? Collaboration. Even it says tolerance, right? It's like disagreements will happen when we walk out of the door, we're one, but we have vigorous arguments. Jessica, we have vigorous arguments, right? Jessica is an ex-Evive, but like a founding member. She was through all the trenches. And so we wrote down those values: respect, customer focus, right? Honesty. We make a mistake, we own it, and we tell the customer how we're going to fix it. Because, whose software doesn't have bugs, right? If your CTO told you your software has no bugs, he's lying. Google has bugs, Apple has bugs, we all have bugs. And so those values then allow us to have a language to do. And then you hire people, like I can spot an Evive person, and lots of Evive people know this, like I'll spot an Evive person from far. I still make mistakes, but I'm pretty good at saying, that's an Evive person. They at least match our values. Then skill set matching and our needs, and our needs diverge over time with their skill set, etc. All of that happens. But our values, our managers, our leaders sort of reflect who I am or who Peter and I stand for, or what Evive stands for, and they represent.
And how do you view your own role in setting the culture. Obviously, in the early days, you're a doer. Company grows.
Yeah.
That role has to evolve. What's your leadership style today?
Yeah. So I used to tell new employees, like, we're all adults, so I'm not going to track what time you come in, what time you go out. We all talk about the mission. We're dedicated to the mission. We talk about sort of work-life integration, which is I take the conference call at 10 o'clock at night with the same enthusiasm that I go to the grocery store in the middle of the day if that's what I have to do. Right? I don't differentiate between, well, but that's work at 9:30 and that's my lifetime. And that's life in the afternoon because the cable guy is going to come. Well, that's just life. And so I think that's sort of super critical to how I model. I think the big sort of role for me now is to make sure that people feel recognized when they do good things, that they're accountable. They know that I'm watching, because a lot of people need validation when they do great things, and then they do even greater things. And so I make it a point, like on Wednesday I came in, I had no appointments. I was like, wow, this never happens to me. And I was so exhausted at the end of the day because I stopped by desks, I talked to people on what they were doing and all of that. And the day went by fast, but that's like every day. I mean, I stop by desks all the time.
That's interesting. Stephen and I were, New Jersey last week or Pennsylvania. We were with Glenn Tolman from Livongo, and Glenn started telling the story of how he does the exact opposite, how he publicly shames people, and I thought it was really interesting. That he said, look, it's great to call out good behavior, but what do you learn from that? If I call out your bad behavior, then everybody knows not to ever do that again, and you get a lot more out of it. And I think he was being a little bit ironic. But,
right.
But
I know Glenn very well.
A funny twist on.
Yeah, I think. Look, we hold each other accountable because we're on the same team. And I actually took a guy out yesterday for coffee because he was offended by something I said the day before that made him feel like his team was not valuable. And I took him out and I said, first of all, I owe you an apology, because if you felt that way, I was wrong. Now let me tell you what I was saying, but how I said it, if it hurt your feelings, I was wrong. And so you have to own every mistake. Otherwise, the organization doesn't learn that they can own a mistake, and it's okay. In our culture generally, and Indians, I'll generalize, but we celebrate a success a lot. Like my parents are all about success, but it's really the failures that you have to be okay with to get that. And failing is like part of the journey, right? I mean, if I charted out my bad hires, my bad strategy decisions, like I've failed more than I've succeeded, and I think that's important for the organization to know.
And you make an example of yourself on.
You have to lead. You can't ask people to do something you don't do yourself, right? I mean, when I ask people to work I was working on Christmas Eve because we had a major release. Well, you can't ask people to work on Christmas Eve if you're not willing to do it yourself.
So what does the future hold for Evive?
What's the future hold? We're in the second inning of a 9-inning game, which is a terrible thing to say. Meredith doesn't want to hear that at all. We've been 13 years at it, and he thinks he's in the second inning. This is bad. When is he ever going to finish? But I think there's a lot to do in healthcare. And the thing that keeps me driving, we released a tool that helps people pick the right health plan. And employers in general are indifferent to what health plan you pick because they're defined contribution, basically. Your premium is the actual value of that plan. But I remember sitting at a customer and she said, look, I care about people being in the right plan because that person taking an extra $1.25 home an hour when he makes $9.75 an hour is huge. For his children, for Thanksgiving, for Christmas. You and I don't care about the $1.25 an hour. Well, I do, I take the train every day, but we don't in general. But it's transformative, and I think that in healthcare, even today, depending on what stat you believe, 25 to 30% of money is being spent on things that are either ineffective or with just price variation of the same thing at the same quality but different price, etc. And so optimizing the right care at the right place at the right time, sort of all of that is still a mission that is still out there. Healthcare is not a consumer business, despite 12 years of Prashant sort of spending 24 hours thinking about it and doing something about it. It's not. And so it's still a second inning of a 9-inning game.
So we've got some questions coming in. Feel free to send them as well. I think Stephen mentioned where you can send those. We talked about what it takes to attract great hires. How do you know how to avoid a potentially bad hire? You and I have both, and I think every entrepreneur has felt the pain of making that mistake. It's costly, it's time consuming, it's emotionally painful. Any advice for how to avoid it?
I think one of the things, especially as you get past the first band of 30 is like anyone who will follow you and spend the big hours that it takes at the beginning. But I think after that, like really critically thinking about the job and building a scorecard for the job. Because like we used to sit down at Evive at the end of the interviews and we'd be like, thumbs up or thumbs down. And today we look back, we're like, yeah, we were 50-50 on that, right? But now we're sort of objectively thinking about like, what does it take? What does success look like for this job? And we're looking in the interview for patterns of that success. And when I say, start at your first living memory or start at your, when you graduate college or whatever, what you're looking for is a pattern that individual drives, that's driving them. And if it matches what your job is, like if your job is going to be QA, you don't want this risk-taking individual, because that's QA, like you want the guy, like be a stickler. And if he folds, his underwear and all of that, that's really good, because that's a stickler. If you look at my shelves, they're all like just tossed in there. And so I think people exhibit these patterns not just in work. What you're looking for is not an example of how you did QA in the last job. It's like you're trying to find a pattern, because people's life pattern very hard to change or fake. People's 1 job, 2 job experience, exaggerated, whatever, easier to do. But your life pattern, like you can't. Like if I went out and said, look, I'm a rule follower, I do this, you're like, Prashant, nothing about your life looks like you were following the standard ladder. You quit this job and you were like on the cusp of being in this ladder, and you quit that and you moved with 2 suitcases to a place you have no idea where you were going. You're not right for QA, man.
Getting a few questions on work-life balance. Basically, how does one run a company, be the CEO of a company, and have any semblance of a personal family life?
Oh my God.
Any tips?
Meredith's watching on the live stream.
No, we hang out here and we do that. Yeah. That's
right. We hang out here. I think work-life balance is. I prefer work-life integration, because work-life balance makes it seem like I have work for 40 hours, I have life for 84 hours or whatever, like, blah, 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 right? I mean, it's like, I don't have that. I think what you want is, your relationships want consistency, right? So, for example, I'm going to take an 8:30 call after this tonight at home, and I told Meredith that this morning. So that she expects, like it's not like Prashant walks in after the whole day, and he walks in and he gets on the phone and now he's doing this, right? It's sort of, that's going to happen, but it's going to happen with expectations set correctly at the front. Because I think your expectations, your relationships demand consistency, they demand and they demand time, by the way, also. And so, I turned down an 8 o'clock meeting this morning because I said I'm hanging out with my 1-year-old. And so you just have to make these trade-offs, and it's all just life, like to me. And for most entrepreneurs, by the way, there's no difference between work and life. Like, David, does your this stop working on Sunday when we're watching the kids swim in the pool? It doesn't, right?
No.
And so there is no such thing where we separate these things. What we have to make sure is we're present in each place, and that we set expectations when these things go across. And I'm not perfect at all, like this. Like I'm terrible, but what I've learned in 13 years is like setting expectations, being honest about like, hey, I'm going to get out on Sunday at 2 o'clock and take a call. No surprises is probably a better way to go than the opposite.
People really want to hear more about consequential mistakes.
Yeah.
So can you share anything about mistakes that you've made, what you've learned from them? The more painful, the better, apparently.
The more painful, the better. Well, I think a lot of times you fall in love with your own ideas. Oh, never happened to you at all, right? And I think what's sort of what didn't kill you, that's good, right? But we do, we drink our own Kool-Aid a lot, and I've done that a fair number of times. Where you have a vision for how the world should work, and you try really hard and run after that when the world doesn't change because you tried it just by yourself. And so just validating what I've learned more from all of those failures is validating it with customers. So we now go talk to customers on out of the world ideas. Right? We're like, look, this is a moonshot idea, we want to talk about it. And then they'll be like, oh, but this little part, if you just did that, you didn't have to go to the moon. Just do that and I'll pay for that. And you're like, oh, well, but we wouldn't have that conversation if we didn't throw something outrageous out there. To say, hey, we're going to go do this. And they're like, well, walk me through that. And we walk them through and they're like, oh, just do that for now. And we're like, okay. And so it's sort of like an agile method, right? In agile, like you set out some vision, but you don't know exactly if that's the right vision. It moves. But you make small moves, right? And sprints, we do 2-week moves or whatever. Because we don't exactly know where the product's going to end up. We have some idea. And there have been times where we built it and then we were like too smart for the user, which is bad. That's not too smart. That's just bad.
I want everybody to realize what's happening here. I asked Prashant about a mistake, and we heard about a bunch of things we did right. This is the entrepreneurial chip. We can't own them.
Yeah, you have to be. That's probably right. So I'll tell you exact mistakes, but you're right. You have to be incredibly optimistic.
We're talking about real mistakes here, not the ones you wanted to make.
No. We made real mistakes. We send the wrong mailings to the wrong people, and then we had to send. And we thought the company was over. In HIPAA, if you send the wrong thing to the wrong person, that's bad. Company's over. And we recovered from it. We owned it. We sent out something to mitigate that. And, there's like a slew of those where mistakes happened where the QA person didn't catch it. But big strategic mistakes I was talking about where I fell in love with an idea where I said, if we do it this way, we're gonna make it. And we launch it and people can't even understand, it's too smart for the user, which is just bad. And so I've done that 3 or 4 times, and now what we've learned from that is go validate early, before you do something. You build it and you show it, and you're like, oh no, you missed the whole thing, right? This is beautiful waterfall. You build it all, and you're like, oh, that's not what we wanted.
Another question on what you feel like you're least good at and how you're addressing that gap. Whether personally, whether the company, however you want.
Oh my God. I'm terrible at so many things. I'm terrible at details, but I force myself through it because I think just sort of inspiring alone is not enough. I think driving accountability requires you sometimes to go through excruciating detail. And I'm terrible at it. If I had to write that project plan, break it down into story points, I'd be terrible at it. But I think just helping people walk through that and just forcing myself to listen to all that is sort of helping us create a culture where people think through that better because you're paying attention. And I think that's the hardest thing for me because I have if Ritalin was as freely available when I was a kid as it is now, I would have been on it on day one. I have the worst forms of ADD, but I sit through this stuff in detail because I know it matters, right? Details matter. It's not just a big idea. Because most ideas fail because of poor execution, not because they were bad ideas. And so I force myself to sit through enormous detail, through deal review, every single thing, because it matters.
Another question on when you first thought you would be capable of becoming a CEO. When did you know you had what it took?
I don't think I'm still capable. I think if you start your own business, you can call yourself anything, right? So I'm the CEO. I think the better question is when you thought you know how to lead. because the title, regardless, I mean, we have a lot of leaders in our company who are not CEOs, but they're born leaders. And when you realize that when people follow, like when you say something and they feel sort of this sense of, like, I trust this person enough that I'm going to follow. We sat in an Elephant and Castle and interviewed our second employee. Our first employee, we interviewed at a McDonald's. And they should have been thinking, like, healthcare company, you're interviewing me at a McDonald's? Or Elephant, and I said, where do you want to meet? He said, oh, there's an Elephant and Castle by my office, let's go meet there. And we were like, okay, Elephant and Castle. But when we explained this idea to those people and they started to follow, then you're like, okay, that's really exciting. When and this happened before many times where, once people believe in your skills, you actually start to have that belief also. And so when I first solved my first real world problem at ExxonMobil, I knew, I was like, wow, that's really, I actually know how to apply the stuff I learned and that people follow. And that's a gift that you have to use sort of very carefully, because it's a trust bond between us, and our first employee is still with us, our second is still with us. It's a bond of trust, and you got to live up to it every time.
Here's an interesting question that I get all the time. The role, and if you felt like you needed a formal business education to start a company, they're asking really about your MBA. Was it required?
Yeah.
And could you have done it without it?
So I was I was a chemical engineering PhD, really in the thick of inventing new drugs. And so the first thing that the MBA helped me do is change the world's perception. Because if I went to Pfizer and said, I want to run M&A, they're like, what? Right? And so the Booth MBA did allow me to change that. The second thing is that I always had ideas. I just didn't know which one to quit my job for and go for. Right? I mean, we all have ideas. I'm in the shower every day thinking, wow, we should do X. And there's a class at Booth called Commercializing Innovation, where Scott Meadow gives you a paragraph about that long every week. And you have to figure out if you would build a company and invest in it or not. And so just doing that week in and week out for 10 weeks gave me the framework that we used for Evives thesis, for many other pitches before that, to say, is this worth doing? Because otherwise, we all have ideas. The problem is we don't know. When you make a leap of faith, right, you're going to quit your job, tell your wife you're quitting. We had a 4-month baby when I quit. You have to know, like, hey, this is worth doing. There's a big market out there. We don't know how we're going to get it. But if we do reasonably well, this is worth taking the chance on. And so that's what the Booth MBA, like if I could pick one thing to do at Booth, it would be commercializing innovation. Outside of that, everything else was helpful, right? Financial accounting, all this stuff. Because I had an engineering background, I didn't know, how funny games can be played on accounting or allocation of costs and things that now allow me to be a better seller because I understand how the buyer budgets. And so those are useful things. I can't tell you each one of those that help every day, but I think commercializing innovation was critical to at least my journey. So I would say, was the MBA worth it? For that one class, it was. And I took it the first quarter I went into Booth. You're supposed to take it the last one, when you do all the stuff and you can actually have the skills. But I took it the first one because that's all I ever wanted to do.
Is there anything you're particularly excited about in healthcare, health tech right now that's emerging that you see and you say, that's it, that's the coming trend, apart from what Evive is doing?
Good one. I think there's an increased sort of understanding of how data might change the world. It's still not clear economically if data will be free to do that. Right? We talked about interoperability before this. Like everyone will be like, oh, interoperability, we should do it because it's going to open up all these applications, do all this stuff, improve care, coordinate, remove waste, blah, blah, blah. But economically, the barriers are so big to interoperability that there is no economic reason to have it. The hospital doesn't want you to take your stuff and leave. That I think there's more of an awareness. In fact, the Trump administration is going to sort of ask plans to open up the data to developers at the individual's permission, which is huge. Before this, they asked hospitals to open up APIs. And it's all slow. Like it doesn't happen blue button. All this stuff doesn't happen overnight. But I think there's more momentum for that to free up the data so individuals control it than there was ever before. And I think if that happens, there'll be a lot of value created for the individual because they'll drive who they give data to and what they get in return.
So last question, obligatory question in any of these, what advice would you have for anybody who's setting out right now, starting a company, trying to achieve what something
I think the big thing that came out of the previous session we were talking to was figure out how money flows in your industry. Like we were saying at Evive, we're very proud of our technology, our AI, our big data, blah, blah, blah. But the real thing that helped us was figuring out how money flows in healthcare from self-insured employers to ASO plans to providers and how all of that works. Because no matter how good your technology, how good your idea, if you don't figure out how your economic engine will run, nothing's going to happen. You can build the world's best AI, and if no one buys it, you're not doing anything else. And so I think that, I would say, is the primary, and we often overlook it because a lot of us have tech backgrounds and we're like, wow, if we build this application and it just tweaked it some more, it's going to be perfect. And you're like, who cares? Like, let's figure out if it matters to someone. Because if it doesn't matter, like you're like, like a sculptor and you keep working on it. And it's like, well, if nobody appreciates art, why bother? And so I think that's probably the most important thing I would say. The second thing that just from my own experience is if you can get a partner with complementary skills, have it. Because there are so many days where you are down and hopefully he's level, he or she is level, and when they're down, you are up. Like there are so many ups and downs. This is like if stomach ulcers happens each time this happened, like I would have no stomach left, right? I mean, and so I think it's super helpful to have somebody in the trenches because it's super lonely when you make these make or break decisions, right? And when we were bootstrapped, we didn't have a board or anything, so it's just like Peter and I looking at each other like, should we do this?
Seems like a good idea.
Yeah. No, but I think it's super helpful because, and Peter ran sales and I ran software development and everything else in the beginning. It was helpful because there's a lot to do at the beginning, a lot. And if you're a sole founder running around, there's only so much you can do in 24 hours. And there's just not enough hours in the day. So if you can find a partner who can sort of live this journey with you, it was super helpful to me. I actually remember reading a stat at the beginning that said, your odds of making it are 70% higher with a partner. We're like, well, at least we got that right. And then we'll figure out everything else later. And Peter and I looked at each other, we're like, oh, we got one thing. We're going to make it 5 years. We have 70% greater chance of doing this. But I think that's helpful. And otherwise, it's super lonely and just very difficult.
Prashant, this was fun. Thank you so much.